That's some of the measures that were announced yesterday by Eskom and by the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, who you saw there, to try and ensure that there is only stage 1 load shedding at the most during the winter months. At the same time, of course, there's also issues around Eskom's finances. An announcement yesterday, it needs another 250 billion rand to pay back its debt. Ted Blom is an expert on electricity and finance. Has been looking at these issues for quite some time. He's in our studios for you now. Ted, good evening. Thank you for coming in.
Good evening.
Obviously, I mean, you start off by saying this is a difficult situation. I mean, everyone understands that. Everyone realizes from a technical point of view sort of what needs to be done. Do you believe it's possible to just keep it to stage 1 load shedding over winter, or do you think it's stage 2 or stage 3 are more likely?
Okay, so, I mean, on a technical issue, I think I just need to clarify. By capping stage 1 load shedding, as the Minister seemingly has tried to do, you've got the tail wagging the dog. The load shedding is there to release pressure off the grid. If the grid is overstrained, they do the load shedding and then that brings it back into balance. So nobody, not you, not me, not the Minister or the CEO of Eskom, can dictate how much load shedding it should be or not be. The system dictates how much load shedding is necessary to stay alive. So if you transgress that fundamental rule, you run the risk of melting down the grid and a total blackout for the country for either weeks or years, depending on whether it's controlled or uncontrolled meltdown. So, is it feasible? No. It's just pot luck as to where you end up on the load shedding thing. More so if you're running aged fleets and you're running them harder. And this is where there's a conundrum with what the Minister's statement says. On the one hand, he says he's keeping the lights on, as in 2010. On the other hand, he's saying he's increasing maintenance. Now, boilers are pretty hot. You can't do maintenance while the boilers are running. So you either keep the lights on, which seems to be his first choice, or you do maintenance, but you can't do them simultaneously.
But I mean, there are consequences either way. I mean, this is a typical catch-22. If you don't keep the lights on, the economy is going to tank, right?
Absolutely.
And if the economy tanks, then you're not going to have the money to fix it.
Absolutely.
So isn't there a case to say it's the right thing to run it hard and hope for the best and see if some other solution comes along?
No, there are other solutions, Stephen. I came out about a month ago and said maybe it's not in Eskom's best financial interest, but it's certainly in your and my and South Africa's interest to allow household solar to go onto the grid. If they do that and allow the meters to run backwards, then you and I as contributors to the grid will get paid at the Eskom rates. And secondly, we will inject 8 gigawatts of power into the grid, enough to put end to daylight load shedding. And I'm not worried too much about the nighttime load shedding. I know it's got security implications, but I'm critically concerned about daytime load shedding, because that normally means loss of jobs. That's the first alternative. The second alternative, and we discussed that when I was at Eskom in 2008, which was the first time we had major load shedding, was there's two options. You either bring in power barges, okay, which are easily for rental, and we've got 30 days notice, or you bring in Russian submarines, because they've got nuclear power generators of 500 megawatts a throw. One of those two options. Now, neither of them are cheap, but the cost of the cost of putting in power barges is equivalent to 3 days load shedding. The Minister is forecasting 26 days of load shedding. Surely it's far better to take some of that money, and he maybe needs to go and borrow it from the tax authorities because they were getting the benefit by having more economy going on, and take that money and go and buy a set of barges that will give us 5 gigawatts. It will cost about 10 billion rand, and it can be here and installed within 30 days.
Okay, I mean, that sounds, I mean, I think some people might say that's the first time they've ever heard it. It sounds almost too good to be true.
No, that concept is old. Kenya, in fact, has been doing it for the last 10 years because they had power problems. Other states, when they have a state of emergency, like maybe Mozambique or whatever, then they hire these barges on a temporary basis for 6 months or a year until they can reinstate their own networks.
Okay, people are being asked to cut back on the amount of electricity they use. So some businesses, if they can, they're investing in their own generation, whether it's solar or whatever. People are doing that in homes as well. Has the calculation been done to see if the companies that can afford it, and the, I presume, middle-class suburban people who can afford it, if they were all to do that, never mind the running the meter backwards and attaching and doing the grid, there might be other complications. But if all of the people who could invested in their own generating capacity for their own use, would that take enough strain off the grid to avoid load shedding, in your view? Has someone done those numbers?
Well, Eskom has done those numbers. They did them in 2013. It was done through their scientific department, T&D, And their number and my number come very close to each other, and that is that it's between 4 and 8 gigawatts, depending on how many people take up the offer to generate their own electricity, or how big the installations are. Obviously, if you put a massive installation on board, you could generate excess electricity. And by the same token, if you take these power barges and you take one lot to Richards Bay and another lot to Mozambique, Maputo, that's where two of the biggest guzzlers of electricity are, the Alusaf aluminium smelters. They each use about 4 gigawatts. So if you put a set of barges in there and a set of barges in Maputo, you take 8 gigawatts of strain off the grid. That creates space for Eskom to do proper maintenance, not this half-witted stuff that they do over weekends and in a rush and so on. They can then strip the tubes out where they need to do a proper 6-month refurbishment per boiler and hopefully reinstate us to where we should have been if all this corruption and maladministration hadn't taken place.
Ted Blom, thanks very much indeed for coming in, the energy expert there. Really do appreciate it. It seems